Hello and welcome to Nükhet Varlık's lecture, Past Plagues in the Time of COVID-19, Why the Islamic Plague Experience Matters. My name is Maite Green Mercado, and I am an assistant professor of Islamic and Mediterranean history at Rutgers University, Newark. Along with my colleagues Gary Farney and Brian Murphy, I am a co-founder and co-director of the Mediterranean Displacements project at Rutgers Newark, which organized and hosted this talk as part of our inaugural lecture series. Fittingly, this talk about plague was held on Zoom. It was recorded on Wednesday, October 21st, 2020. At the top of the lecture, I will introduce our guest, whose lecture will be followed by questions. The entire presentation runs an hour and 10 minutes. I would like now to introduce our speaker for today. We are very, very lucky to have Professor Nükhet Varlık share her work with us today. Professor Nükhet Varlık is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers Newark. She is a historian of the Ottoman Empire, interested in disease, in medicine, and public health. She is the author of Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience 1347 to 1600. It came out in 2015 with Cambridge University Press, and she is also the editor of Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean 2017. Her new project, Empire, Ecology, and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, circa 1340 to 1940s, examines the 600-year Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context. In conjunction with this research, she is involved in developing the Black Death Digital Archive and contributing to multidisciplinary research projects that incorporate perspectives from paleogenetics, this is ancient DNA research in particular, bioarchaeology, disease ecology, and climate science into historical inquiry. She is the editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, and I don't know if some of you have seen, but since the pandemic started, she has given over 60 lectures. She gives around 2 or 3 lectures per week. So she's very generous in sharing her work with us today. And her most recent piece, she has done a lot of interviews as well. She has an upcoming interview with the BBC and was in Australian radio the other day. But her recent piece on October 14th in The Conversation is titled, How Do Pandemics End? History Suggests Diseases Fade, but are almost never truly gone. And this work was translated into Spanish, this piece, and it has at least, for now, 240,000 views. So we're very, very excited to have Professor Varlık here with us to talk to us about past plagues in the time of COVID-19, why the Islamic plague experience matters. Professor Varlık.
Okay, thank you for this generous introduction, Maite, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Let me just start by saying that it's really a great pleasure to be in the inaugural event of this project that I'm actually very excited about, and it's extremely timely. And of course, given that we are now in a pandemic and in an age of climate change, displacements are something that have historically become an important topic for societies, but it is also one we are facing today. So moving forward, this will be something that historians and policymakers will have to take into closer consideration. And as well as I will try to point out in my talk, disease, climate, and displacements have always worked in tandem with each other. And that said, let me share my screen so I can show my slides. Can you see? Okay, great. I would like to start with a few questions. Basically, we're in a pandemic, and so I'd like to start by having us think about the question of what does it mean to be a historian of past pandemics during a pandemic? How do we think about past pandemics in the light of what we learn about an unfolding and still continuing pandemic? And how do we rewrite history? How do we change, think through, revise, and recreate our historical narratives as we go through a global pandemic ourselves today? And so on this point, I think the most important thing that can be said is that every pandemic actually creates new narratives about past pandemics. Every time there is a pandemic, you see an increase in the writing of scholarship, not only biomedical scholarship, but at the same time, scholarship coming from the humanities and social sciences discussing historical and current day pandemics. So there is a flurry and explosion in research, but at the same time, this is also an opportunity for us to rethink what we think we know, or what we think the way we imagine historical pandemics. And just a very quick example to think about this is the very famous work by Daniel Defoe, the Journal of Plague Year in London. It is about the 1665 plague outbreak in London, but it is written during the plague of Marseille in 1720. In fact, plague of Marseille is something that I'm going to go back to in my research later on, in my talk later on, but just to make the point that every time there is a new pandemic, there is a new disease outbreak, you see that kind of rethinking in process. So, and because I specialize in the Islamic world, my research has, of course, is primarily from the Ottoman Empire and the larger Islamic world, the Mediterranean world, but also has implications to understand broader historical narratives about the history of plague. So, and here, of course, with this question in mind, I would like us to think about historical narratives about plague, plague scholarship in particular, and the issues that we have in thinking about the Islamic world. So some of the key concepts that I will be talking about today is the Eurocentric nature of plague scholarship, that it is a very positivist scholarship, and it is very human-centric, and I will explain all these in detail. But also I would like to think about the kind of historical imagination that emerges from these narratives as forms of imaginations that we still continue to use today. So hopefully I will try to establish a kind of a dialogue between how we think of pandemics and how our historical pandemics teach us. So let me start with a very recent piece of scholarship, an article that I wrote this year actually during the pandemic. And in this, for anyone interested, it's open access, but I'd like to make 2 points from this research. First of all, we define today, in the 21st century, we define or want to think of pandemics as short-term cataclysmic events. But I would like to challenge this type of thinking about plague and kind of invite us to rethink of past pandemics and current pandemics, not as short-term events, but as something that we should think as a long-term process. So not an event, but a process. And at the same time, I think it's really important to understand and define pandemics as global phenomena. And I will get back to why this is important. So after making these points, let me just move on to another piece I very recently published. This just came out as part of a special issue produced during the pandemic in a History of Science journal. And here I tried to rethink Eurocentric historical narratives in the way they depicted Ottoman plague narratives, and why this tells us something that has still implications for thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, this piece is also open access for anyone interested in. Here, basically, I was looking at a very significant point in time, the Plague of Marseille. Plague of Marseille from 1720, 1721 was an outbreak of plague that happened in the French city, port city of the Mediterranean, Marseille, and also in its surroundings. And some historians are calling it now the Plague of Provence. So just, affecting a larger area than the city of Marseille, and resulted in the death of at least 100,000 people. But this pandemic, this epidemic, exactly 300 years ago, actually, is still one that has been extremely important in the historical narratives, in the sense that when you look at 18th and 19th century historical epidemiology produced primarily in Europe and also in the 20th century in other parts of the world, you see a very significant narrative of diseases coming from Oriental regions. And Oriental, I'd like to use it in quotation because it's not a defined geographic area. It is more like an obscure, fuzzy concept that comes up in these narratives, in historical narratives. And these Oriental landscapes are usually associated with disease and as dark origins of disease that comes to Europe more specifically. These narratives, again, have been circulated over and over again throughout the early modern period in Europe, mostly structured and expanded by the writings of European travelers to the Ottoman Empire and other parts of the Islamic world, but created as a result of these narratives. You see this image of the Oriental landscape as a sickly landscape, right? As a land of disease, as a land of plague, and it is situated as a location, as a place that disease comes from, and disease affects Europe. And in these narratives, you see Europe always situated as, if not a victim, at least recipient of disease that comes from outside. So in the historical imagination of Europe, you see this element very consistently, that Europe disease comes from outside. In fact, that relates to some of my earlier research, which showed that historically speaking, that's not an accurate factual narrative, right? But the Plague of Marseille is also important because, starting with the Plague of Marseille, we see these narratives about Oriental disease and stereotypical vision of the Oriental bodies as sickly bodies as something that had been more directly integrated in the historical and scientific scholarship on disease. So starting in the 18th, 19th centuries, we see these narratives repeated over and over again in a way that basically inform science and scientific writing even today. And in these narratives, you have not only the Oriental landscape as the source of disease, but you also see a narrative in which Europe is positioned as an area that managed to protect itself from plague. So we see the rise and emergence of a triumphalist narratives in which, yes, the Plague of Marseille happened, but Europe survived, in fact, came out even stronger, right? Europe is, defined in these narratives as a entity that combated the disease, as opposed to those backward, irrational, superstitious Orientals that do not understand the notion of contagion, that do not have social and scientific organization to deal with the disease effectively. And in Europe, the rise of sanitation, better hygiene in the cities, urbanization, quarantine and isolation practices are basically depicted as something that helped defeat the disease. In fact, primarily plague. But we know today that this narrative is what it is. It's a narrative. And in fact, my research directly deals with some of the issues that this narrative claims to accept. But again, here, yes, it's a historical narrative contained in history books, but its implications are more important than that. And we know that from today. We know today that, for example, in the case of COVID-19, we know that a pandemic, it cannot be reduced to a virus. I mean, we know how the virus circulated all over the world, but we also know different parts of the world were affected in different ways and responded to disease in different ways. So disease, a pandemic, is always larger than the virus, the bacterium, the pathogen it represents. So we need to take into account all the different local contexts and social responses and whatnot. So in the same way, we also know that the way people make sense of pandemic and develop policy, develop response is also something that should be understood as part of those larger narratives. So what I am actually trying to say is that the historical narratives that developed during the pre-modern period not only have implications in thinking about our own pandemic, but also it is the set of responses that people produce during pandemics is what informs science and the way we think about it. So, okay, that's just here showing the conclusion of that piece, basically trying to make that point that, you know, Plague of Marseille 300 years ago, still informing the ways we think about it. And just one example is how the what I call Oriental epidemiological Orientalism, the association of the Oriental landscape with disease, and depiction of Europe, you know, outside of this entity as the recipient of disease from the East. And in fact, later on in the 19th century, we see that Oriental category even expanded to include other parts of Asia. So it's not only the lands of the Muslims, it's something that could be, you know, that could start from, let's say, Istanbul all the way to Hong Kong, right? It's all the sickly landscape that comes up in historical narratives. But the connection to this is that the disease entity is something that can easily be associated with the other. In early days of the pandemic, we all saw how, you know, Trump called it a China virus, Chinese virus, foreign virus. So it did not come from nowhere. That discourse itself, I mean, we all know that it has its own political context, but in the long term, there is a tradition in the Western culture of associating diseases with the other. And in fact, in the long history of pandemics, we see many examples of, you know, othering of other societies by associating them with the disease. Okay, so more specific questions for this talk is, I'm a historian of plague, and plague is a bacterial infection, so it's not very similar to what we're going through today with the COVID-19 pandemic. And because the biology of the disease, its transmission mechanisms are different, so it's not a direct comparison. In fact, I'm not trying to use plague here as a direct comparison with COVID-19. What I am actually trying to do is to think of historical insights that we can develop on the basis of past pandemics and see if we can think through these historical insights and integrate them to the way in which we understand pandemics and we respond to it. And my research, you know, in particular, the history of plague in the late medieval and early modern period in the Islamic Mediterranean in particular, but the larger Mediterranean world as well, just trying to pose this question of the European experience of plague, in the way Europe experienced of plague, basically is not a good model to build historical scholarship on. And I will try to show why, and also asking the questions of historical assumptions about plague, and where we are basically looking at the wrong place to develop our historical narratives. All right, so let me start by this map, in particular, trying to see, what is wrong with the Eurocentric historical narratives. So here we're looking at a map that allegedly tells us about the Black Death. Black Death being the mid-14th century plague pandemic that affected a very large area of Afro-Eurasian world. So in this map, as you will all notice, we only see Europe and just a little bit of its surroundings, and but this creates the illusion that Europe is the only place that has been affected by this pandemic, which is far from the truth. And in fact, only the other places in the surrounding area are represented so much as it helps us understand European history better. So with the assumption that this cannot be the kind of historical vision that we today need to follow, let me just show another model which might help us think through the same problem on a larger scale. This is not a map that shows us the distribution of plague. This research comes from a study of urban connectedness in the 14th century. So this map tells us how Afro-Eurasia was a connected area. And the dots that we see are basically like urban hubs, and the greater the connectivity to other urban areas, the bigger the circle. So if we are looking here in the 14th century, how connected the world was, how can we even think that Europe is the only location that was affected by Black Death? And just, thinking that plague did not have a treatment before the 20th century. In fact, antibiotics, started only becoming common after the 1950s, 1960s. And because it's a big plague is a bacterial infection, it can be treated with antibiotics. And even the bacterial agent of the disease was not discovered until 1894. In other words, before the end of the 19th century, nowhere in the world was an efficient technology or medical knowledge that could prevent its spread. And so when we're looking at the connectedness of mid-14th century world, we are probably looking at the imprint of the different kind of trajectories that plague may have circulated in. And in this, isolating Europe from this map, it just doesn't make sense. So the way I see this is, today, when we look at plague scholarship, what's been written about and published about plague, and what we know is probably just looking at the tip of that iceberg. And in the meantime, we miss a majority of plague's history. Why is this important? Is this important only as a source of curiosity, or something that's just, not well known that we should understand? Part of the reason is the imbalance in the scholarship. So the tip of the iceberg, the area that we think that we see, has been studied at least for the last 200 years by a very large number of scholars in many different European languages. Texts have been published and edited. Hundreds, if not thousands of books have been written on the subject, and we know about that story in greater detail. In fact, if we want to think of the plague experience of the Black Death experience of Africa, for example. We know so very little. Until very recently, we did not even know whether the mid-14th century plague, and let me just go back to this map, and again, you can't even tell that plague spread anywhere on the continent, right? And this map comes from a 2004 publication on the Black Death. So we had no idea what was going on in Africa. Archaeologists or the last couple of years have been digging in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa in particular, and finding signs of abandonment consistently throughout very large regions that can be dated to sometime in the 14th century. And so that led archaeologists to question that whether this may be connected, like large displacements. When you see abandonment of locations, in fact, one of the important signs of either a natural disaster, a climatic pressure, or some other kind of social trauma, and disease certainly, fits in this definition. So there is ongoing research that in fact shows that plague, like Black Death, and perhaps it's after recurrent waves, may have spread to sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, when we shift our attention a little east, looking toward like Eastern Mediterranean and even east of it to Central Asia, again, we have very strong evidence that plague circulated in Asia as well. Again, until we have genetic material, it is difficult to speak with certainty, but we have historical accounts that support, in fact, show very precisely that Black Death was much larger in scale, and also in terms of its effects. And again, textbook definition of plague and Black Death, usually you see a mortality of like, 1/3 of Europe is always, what we hear, or 40% in some cases. Well, we have evidence that it killed as high as 50 to 60% in places. The other thing that I would like to emphasize here, the Black Death is not a pandemic that is an event. And so that takes me to the first point I was trying to make in the beginning of my talk, right? Let's not think of pandemics as short-term cataclysmic events, because that also affects how we respond to it. If we do it, then we'll think, as we saw in the beginning of this pandemic, people saying, oh, it will just disappear with summer heat. It did not. Or it will just go away on its own. It did not. We have to deal with it. And because this is in the nature of infectious diseases, right? Once they are widespread, and now we're going through this, there is community spread that is very difficult to contain and mitigate, even though we have successful examples coming from different parts of the world, and some countries have been just better in doing this than us. But it's very difficult once it's spread. So the natural behavior of the disease is to spread in a population, right? But at the same time, after a while, at least, this is something that works in the case of plague, but also is in the nature of many other infectious diseases that behave this way. So diseases kind of spread to a population, so a certain number of people are infected. And then whether you do anything or, you don't, they kind of like gradually die down, though that process might take anywhere from a couple of months to a couple of years, depending on climate, humidity, the number of immune and susceptible individuals and whatnot, just, very complex calculations in place. But in the case of plagues, we can definitely tell that, after a while, gradually it will disappear, or it will just, die down. But only after a certain period of time, it comes back. So for the history of plague, perhaps like every 10 to 15 years, in some cases fewer years, it comes back again. And then it retreats and it comes back again. It is a very, when you look at throughout the late medieval and early modern period, this is what people had to deal with. It came back over and over again. So in my research, actually, on the Ottoman Empire, I am just doing this new project on Black Death Digital Archive, and creating this pool of documents about the history of plague in the Ottoman Empire, but also we're including European data now. So showing basically for 600 years, we have evidence of outbreaks of plague coming over and over again. So for that reason, let's shift our thinking from short-term cataclysmic event to a process, because this is a better way of integrating society and history into it. So here, this map is coming from forthcoming research. And in fact, it's revolutionary in the sense that it kind of invites us to a new thinking about the Black Death. So the historical conventional narrative is that, you know, it spread out of the Black Sea region with the Genoese ships coming to Florence and Siena and, Messina from southern Italy and southern Europe, and spreading throughout Europe. Mid-14th century, usually dated as 1346, 47. But now it seems this narrative was, again, just a Eurocentric narrative. All these years, we thought we knew something about this history. You know, it's in every textbook. It's, you know, the Wikipedia page of Black Death receives more than 4 million hits a year, right? So this is the knowledge that we have. Well, this forthcoming research is basically challenging this with very strong ancient DNA evidence that the origin, the point of very origin is as the mountain areas of Kyrgyzstan close to China, that you see one of the dots on the map as the place from which the different strains of the bacterium was distributed across the Afro-Eurasian landscape in the 13th century. So it has very close connections to the Mongol Empire that emerged as an empire in the 13th century and managed to connect a very large area in an unprecedented way, basically, and perhaps in a way that may have facilitated the spread of plague, among other things, with the movement of armies, but also an important component of this narrative is grain trade and displacements of rodents and the movement of rodents and movement of people, of course. So we're not going to think of the history of the Black Death anymore as the mid-14th century event, but rather one that started in the 13th century. But the important lesson to remember from this is that if we only look at that tip of the iceberg, this is what we see. And we miss a large portion of this. Moving on to a little more specific about my own research and what I did so far and what I'm trying to do now, and in a way, hopefully, that I can connect it to the larger themes of Mediterranean Displacement Project is, this is from my 2015 book, looking at the history of plague in the Ottoman Empire from the mid-14th century to the end of the 16th century. One of the most important findings in that book, the research from that book, is that basically I tried to trace the circulation of plague in the Mediterranean, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean world. And this research allowed me to see that the traditional narratives that disease comes from the Ottoman Empire to Europe was basically wrong, because by tracing the individual outbreaks throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, I basically showed that it was the opposite. Throughout the 14th and 15th century into the late 15th century, in fact, we have disease plagues coming from the European ports of the Mediterranean toward the Ottoman Empire, and not the other way around. And only in the 16th century, with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, with the conquest of Syria, Europe, and Syria, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula, and expansions around the Black Sea, we have more complicated plague networks and plague, and so plague circulates in a more complicated fashion. My book also deals with social implications of plague in the Ottoman Empire, and primarily the development of public health mechanisms and the ways in which people's response to disease shaped the way they buried their dead. They thought about hygiene and cleanliness and developing legislation for protecting themselves from disease. In fact, one significant outcome of repeated plague outbreaks in the Ottoman Empire during the early modern period is the development of cemeteries in the city that are mostly removed from the main urban areas. And again, we have, let me see, yeah. So at least if we're looking at the historical peninsula before the conquest of Constantinople, I mean, Istanbul from Byzantine Constantinople, the burial locations were within the church courtyards and within the city, but not a communal cemetery, right, outside of city walls, which in fact only develops in the late 15th century after the Ottomans take over the city. The city's population is expanding, but at the same time, with repeated plague outbreaks, burying the dead in a timely manner becomes a real source of concern for the state administration and for, you know, as a major concern for public health. So we see the development of basically a belt of communal cemeteries outside on the western end of the walls of the city. And other cemeteries also develop over time, but the development of the idea of a separate physical location that created a distance between the living and the dead starts developing as a result of plague outbreaks. So, and my first book was basically dealing with the first couple of centuries of plague's history in the Ottoman Empire, and now I'm trying to understand a long-term the long-term plague experience. And basically, some of the questions that I am really focusing on is how the different biological mechanisms of the disease can be understood in the Ottoman experience of disease, and trying to replace basically the European experience as a model and look at whether we have this longer presence of disease can teach us something that we didn't know. And in that, I am, let me just show this one. This is a jerboa, a small rodent that carries plague, in addition to many other rodents that are responsible for mass plague carriers. So, and this will also connect to the quarantine narrative that I was trying to criticize earlier in my presentation. So basically the consensus that you have in the historical scholarship today is that because Europe started the cordon sanitaires and isolation and quarantine practices across the Mediterranean port cities and also overland boundary between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire, so that protected plague, I mean, that protected Europe from plague coming from the Ottoman Empire. And because the Ottomans were backward, did not have a notion of contagion, did not have quarantine or any other technology that could contain the disease, it continued for a longer time in the Ottoman Empire. So this is pretty much the consensus in the scholarship. So I'm challenging this by basically taking the biology of the disease more seriously, because we know for a fact that, you know, studies coming from today, and also it helps us understand the history of disease because we're talking about the same bacterium that did not change in significant ways when we look at the microevolution of the bacterium involved. So we know that plague is not transmitted from person to person. So if you want to impose quarantine on people, you are not going to stop the spread of the disease, right? But if you have the rodents in a certain area that can sustain the infection for longer periods of time, the disease will always spill over and create new waves, right? So looking at the ecological dimension of disease, I think is here really key, because as historians, we kind of focus too much on human-centric narrative. Plague is not a human disease, so looking only from the human experience is not going to give us the full picture. Again, that's only the tip of the iceberg. So I'm trying to complicate that picture by introducing other actors to this story. One of them is climate, which is, directly related to the behavior of the disease, because it affects precipitation is something that can affect the vegetation in a given area, and the areas that the rodent hosts can occupy. So the rodent reservoirs can shrink or expand as a result of climatic fluctuations. It's also important to take into consideration agriculture patterns, like land use is something that is important, and deforestation and other human interventions in nature, again, come into play. So for all sorts of reasons, we really need to focus on, I believe, ecology, like ecological dimensions of disease, because we know that also during the early modern period, the Little Ice Age, and very important changes going on in climate, and in fact displacements taking place during that time period as well. So we know that the environment really had an important part to play in this. We also know that rodents are important, in fact key, in understanding the behavior of the disease, and the fleas and the vectors that carry to people. So looking at plague history only from the point of view of the human will not give us the full picture. Looking at the quarantines only will not give us the full picture. And we just certainly cannot move with this. I mean, continue to repeat the same narratives that, Oriental region is the origin of the disease. So these narratives don't help us. So on that, I'll try to wrap up by trying to indicate the importance of rodents here, especially this little fellow that we're looking at, a jerboa. How did I get to this, and why does this matter? I'm showing this as an example of the kinds of rodent species that may have been involved in sustaining plague in the Ottoman Empire over long term. And because we know that this is a plague carrier, and as well as other rodents, but there is no evidence that, at least in the 21st century or in the earlier periods, we don't know if this animal actually lived in the Ottoman Empire or not. And so how did I come to this conclusion? Well, I've been going through narrative sources of descriptions of animals, especially rodents. And you don't come across these descriptions every day, because if we're talking about wild rodents, those don't usually occur in cities. In cities, of course, you have rats and mice and others, but not necessarily wild rodents. So it's more difficult to find them. At the same time, you don't always find evidence of wild rodents in the zooarchaeological record, because they don't occur in excavation sites and urban settlements, right? They're outside in the wilderness most of the time. So for that reason, it's difficult. But this one appeared in a 16th century traveler's account, and it was, so detailed that it made it possible for me to kind of to find what that species of rodent was. In fact, there are others like this, but just going back to our jerboa. So my historical insight as a historian, something that comes up in narrative sources, I was determined, like, this is one of the plague carriers, but it's extinct today, at least regionally extinct. In Anatolia, you can't find it. In the Balkans, you can't find it. You have some evidence that, there are smaller populations in Syria, Iraq, but not in Turkey. But recently, over the last 2 years, people captured in cell phone camera, at least 3 sightings of this animal came up in the last 2 years. So just showing as an indication that, of course, in much smaller numbers, nearly depleted, but they are still there. And why am I showing this again? Just as an example of the ways in which we historians can think about diversifying the actors, not only looking at the human evidence, and perhaps looking at other actors that may have been involved. And on that note, I would like to, rodent pictures will not be very popular, I know, but just trying to indicate, in fact, a larger change in the ecology of the region throughout the early modern period, and looking at the extinction of the rodents actually as something that may have over time ended plague, not the quarantines, because the rodents got depleted and extinct regionally, so as the reason for the disappearance of disease. But it probably is something that shows us a larger decline in biological diversity in the region. In fact, looking at artwork, we can see several animals that are depicted in Ottoman miniature art, not necessarily as animals that we know that occurred in the region. And of course, we know like more domesticated animals, cattle and like whatnot yet. Some of them, yes, and others are perhaps, you know, displayed as more exotic animals just for display purposes. But even looking at in which the artist depicted the animals, I think can give us a sense about whether they were familiar with that animal or not, whether they may have seen it or not, right? If it is something that is displayed or depicted completely out of proportion, then we know that it's mostly based on imagination. For all sorts of reasons, I think, including visual evidence and art into the search of, you know, extinct species would be one way of dealing with this question. And just to give you a sense of like the different types of animals that were depicted in the region in the 16th century, but there is no evidence for their existence anymore. In fact, I am using hunting manuals and also photography. It's all the way into the 19th and 20th centuries, and hunting laws, because hunting is one of the main drivers of extinction. And so we have plenty of evidence of this, you know, pointed leopard, for example, that apparently lived in the mountains of northwestern Anatolia and the Balkans at the time, but you don't really have any evidence. I think the last one was shot in 1974 by hunter. And so you have all these like trophy pictures and whatnot. So those are some of my additional sources in trying to kind of trace the decline in biological diversity in Anatolian Balkans in particular. I think I will stop here. Maybe let me just stop with this one, just as an example of showing this is a very famous scene. The Ottoman Sultan Selim, who just, you know, made a big comeback recently as part of a larger debate among the Ottomanists. But here you see the alligators depicted, you know, Selim's, you know, conquest of Egypt and, you know, the Nile. So kind of, you know, that's the scene showing his power and whatnot. But the alligators, when you look at the depiction of probably like a 16th century miniature artist in Istanbul, like probably never saw an alligator in his life, right? And so it looks more like the head like looks more like a wolf than an alligator. And again, these are, I think, just clues into thinking about whether that animal was part of the natural environment or not. I think I will stop here. I don't want to go over time, but I'd be happy to take questions.
This is great. Thank you so very much for this really rich and wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Gary, do you want to?
Does anyone have any questions for the speaker? You could use the Q&A bubble at the bottom to send us a question, or you can digitally raise your hand and I will let you ask your question directly.
I'm going to use my prerogative as one of the organizers of this to start the discussion, if you don't mind. I have a question and also asking for clarification. When you were talking about the quarantining and the lack of success in quarantine, you're very specifically talking about the plague. You're not talking about COVID right now or anything, right? I just wanted to clarify and make sure that that's what you were referring to.
Right. No, I mean, thank you for clarification, and I'm sorry if it wasn't clear. I'm talking about plague in particular, again, just as a biological infection and a rodent borne infection, but in fact, this does not apply at all to human viruses, and COVID is a human virus, is an airborne, so completely different mechanisms of transmission. So no, not even comparable in that sense, yes.
Thank you. So my question, I really appreciate the way that you lay out this historiography, orientalizing historiography of disease, and I do remember that it was when Italy got hit when we really started paying attention to what was going on. Before that, we had heard that this was going on, but we weren't freaking out until all of a sudden Italy has been hit and it's close to home, right? But I'm wondering what you see deorientalizing this narrative does to discourses about COVID today. So why is it necessary to deorientalize narratives of diseases, and what does it do for us today in thinking about the disease that we have, that we're dealing with right now, and responses to it?
Right. I mean, in fact, that point is very relevant. So thank you for the question. When we look at historical outbreaks, as much as we do, our current pandemic, why didn't we hear much about, for example, what was going on in Africa just in the earlier days of the pandemic that COVID was unfolding? There was a measles outbreak going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but at the same time, another strain of Ebola was spread. Right? But those were not covered by international news outlets. And at the moment the outbreak was in Italy, as you mentioned, or was in Europe, we started hearing more about it. So definitely we know that there's a way in which news kind of amplify the significance of the event. And even now, when you look at the numbers now, it's much larger than what it was then, back in the spring, and but it's covered in different ways. So in a way, so our historical narratives did the same thing, like amplifying the significance of a historical phenomena and trying to lead us into thinking in a certain way. So, but why is it important? I mean, of course, for all the reasons that it is important today to think about the pandemic as a global phenomenon, but we want to think about the past in a different way. Just because there are more books written or more evidence exists about a certain part of the world than the other parts of the world don't. I mean, just, we're talking about human life. Clearly, all experience of disease and suffering and death is equally important. But this is not even something that is limited to humanities and social sciences. When you look at genetics, paleogenetics in particular, because today we can retrieve human ancient DNA of the pathogens, different pathogens from human remains, and plague is in fact one of the more successful examples of this practice in science. When you look at paleogenetics and looking at what human bones have been studied, well, I think we have two or very few handful examples of ancient DNA of plague coming outside of Europe. Almost entirely it's European bodies that will tell us a story that we know was global, right? So it's not even only in history, right? Because it's embedded in the scientific literature. And in fact, I mean, that's probably why we historians should take the lead in guiding these research questions, because, then scientists will look at, maybe European archaeological collections have been better preserved or more accessible. So, they will go for collections that are more accessible or can be studied more easily. But you will also kind of miss a larger portion of that story. So it's, of course, extremely important if we want to understand, the human experience.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Nükhet, a few questions have come in, so I'll just rattle a few of them off here. I'm sort of paraphrasing some of these questions, but what kinds of interactions between humans and animals, are people thinking now were especially sort of conducive to spreading plague? I mean, you've all kind of heard about, that just people are cheek by jowl with things like rodents, and so the fleas are just, hopping between them. Is
Right,
that
right.
the consensus sort of opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways actually it can take place. And in fact, it's kind of like part of the same depressing story of 2020. There have been a couple of plague deaths this year. So it's not, it's still like there was a death in New Mexico in August from plague. But it happens usually from the transmission from rodents to humans, mostly if you're handling the animal directly. In apparently a marmot barbecue is a delicacy in like Kyrgyzstan and other parts of like Central Asia. In fact, last year there was a couple who went to Mongolia, I think, and ate marmot kidney, and they died of plague. So, one way is digestion is usually not a very effective way for contracting disease, though people can die. It's mostly human contact with the animal. But I just, I tell this all my students, if you're like hiking, especially in West and North, Southwest states, like don't touch a dead rodent if you see one. It's because the fleas from the animal will just jump off, looking for other hosts. So that's the primary way. But there are also other ways in which it can be transmitted. For instance, one thing is that the fleas can jump to another transitory animal, and then they can jump into humans. So yeah, just
Wow,
if it is enzootic in one region, then like it spills over.
yeah, I never envisioned. I'd always assumed it was just sort of casual contact between animals and people that caused this. But you're talking about people actually physically handling the animals, not just happening to be around them in sort of like a a house context or something. This is like you're really handling them to get this.
The more, I mean, the closer you get, the more dangerous it is. But in some cases, there are no contacts. I mean, a woman just, in the last couple of years in Arizona, I think got from her cat, because the cat got the flea from
Right.
a squirrel or something. So, we don't have it in like the eastern parts of the US, so we're still kind of safe, but we know how these diseases, especially zoonotic diseases, kind of, change over time. Look at the history of Lyme disease, for example, as again, something that is transmitted from animals to humans, and tick, again, not flea in that example. Lyme disease just expanded massively over the last decade, especially with climate change. So it's now everywhere in Canada, and a large part of the US. And again, just climate disease, I mean, climate change is causing these changes.
So just a question that's kind of related to this one from one of the attendees. I might have to read this one out loud because it's a bit more complex. You mentioned that the decrease in plague in Europe may be attributable to the decline in rodent populations. Can you tell us more about how you account particularly for the differences in plague prevalence in Europe and the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period?
Right, a great question. Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, I didn't want to go into too much detail, but first of all, the general consensus in the historical scholarship and among the scientific community today, believe it or not, they still resist the idea that any historical rodent reservoir existed ever in Europe. So still kind of there's a lot of resistance, but there are at least some scientists started to embrace that idea. We don't know. That's a simple answer in terms of like the decline in the number of rodents, how they may have been related. But in terms of the prevalence of the disease, that is something that I think shows a divergence from east and west. So what I mean is, in Europe, you see the gradual decline of outbreaks during especially the 18th century, though you still have smaller outbreaks happening even in early 19th century in like Italy, in Malta, in like Southern Europe. So it starts kind of retreating first from Western and Northern Europe, and that is like late 17th century, early 18th century, and then from Southern and Eastern Europe throughout the 18th century into the 19th century. And I think in that pattern, it kind of follows, like it kind of, starts that retrieval process. And that retrieval process, if you, don't want to think of Ottoman presence as an alien presence in the Mediterranean, but just, one that is connected to European history, you see that process of retreat in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. In fact, accounts coming from the Ottoman sources tell us that the mortality had already declined. Plague mortality was already in a process of decline in the 18th century. And if I may just add a very kind of recent, a very exciting research that just came out a couple of months ago, there is a genetic mutation, a genetic disease common in Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Israel, prevalent in the Eastern Mediterranean. This genetic mutation causes this disease called familial Mediterranean fever, FMF. It's not something that is seen in the US, but this genetic mutation occurs at least in 17% of the population in Turkey, right? But also like Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Turks, so that's kind of the genetic group. This recent research actually found out that that genetic mutation happened historically as a response to plague, to Yersinia pestis, as a way to protect them, because anyone with that genetic mutation did not contract the disease. So in that sense, we have the living imprint, the living legacy of the impact of that disease that lasted for centuries in a certain population of the world that have been historically exposed to this disease by the formation of this, genetic mutation to protect the population. So I hope that answered a question. But
Great, yeah. Just fielding more questions here from actually many good ones here. Student says, I appreciate the way you illustrated the layer of Western Orientalism to include the other as a source of disease. I'm wondering if there are surviving accounts which show whether or not the perspective of these communities included a view that the West was a source of disease through similar like line of reasoning.
Good question, thank you. Yes, in fact, I mean, I was extremely surprised when I first started my research, and that research is, coming from when I was in graduate school before, for my doctoral dissertation, looking in the archival evidence and the narrative sources, that I actually even, was thinking that I was going to find that it was moving from the Ottoman Empire to Europe, but historical sources were telling me otherwise. Most of the time, what you find in these sources is not going to be like a big picture narrative. They, will tell you that it came from this village or from this city, from this direction, right? So kind of a local scale narratives. But then when you put all those local narratives together, then we as historians can construct the big picture, and it is possible to see its progress. So yes, I was surprised to see it, but yes, that's what the sources tell us.
Great, thanks. Let's see, just moving along here. With regards to healthcare differences between Europe and the Arab world during the time frame that you're dealing with, did you find anything striking within the writings of each respective scientific community?
Right, the only thing that I find significant or striking is that it was pretty much the same when you look at Europe and the Islamic world. There may be a few different kind of approaches to treatment in the way these traditions dealt with disease, but throughout the early modern period, all the way to, let's say, 17th, 18th centuries and a late medieval and early part of the early modern period, it is the same body of knowledge that informed those practices, because they were all coming from what was understood to be the medical paradigm in the ancient and medieval world, and that is the Galenic medicine and those traditions inherited by the Muslim world, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and that generation of medical writing and treatment, that was the medicine. So like, let's call it pre-modern medicine. I don't see any use in trying to separate Europe in a way that is different in terms of medical practice and medical ideas from the Islamic world. It was pretty much the same. But in terms of application, like more on the practical end of things, one difference that I find very significant, Muslim physicians had a code of ethics that kind of moderated their use of experimental treatments, in the sense that not harming the patient was really the central code of ethics. If you're not sure about whether your treatment is effective or not, don't take a risk. Whereas we see that European physicians kind of, were a little more lenient in trying experimental treatments because the code of ethics that was, deeply embedded in the Islamic tradition did not necessarily apply. So this does not mean there were no experimental treatments in the Islamic world. I don't want to kind of, create the wrong illusion, but perhaps a little heavily more experimental. But, in those experimental treatments, you can also lose the patient's life, right? And especially for that reason, I worked with Islamic medical manuscripts, and every time you have like a treatment or recipe or something, that is described in those accounts, you usually find notes on the margins that will say, the physician will say, I tried this personally, this works. This is very good, this is tried and true. So only making recommendations on the basis of, so there is an empirical dimension to it, but it has to be safe. So safety was really the main concern.
It's interesting, because that's sort of like the Hippocratic view of things, and it's interesting. I don't know if that's where
right, absolutely,
getting it from, but if so, it's kind of interesting that they're following the Hippocratic idea, whereas Western doctors have really not followed up on the Hippocratic line of reasoning.
Right. Over time, I think kind of they diverge, but only after the 17th century or so. It's kind of like a gradual Paracelsus, and Paracelsian medicine, of course, just, trying heavy metals for treatment. That was not a good idea.
Yeah. So another question here. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. My question is a bit hypothetical. How would and should a non-Eurocentric approach to pandemics change medical research? Could you comment on this topic briefly? And the person also raises that they'd like to mention it specifically with respect to cholera and cholera epidemics. One that they're thinking of started in 1817 in India, but we don't hear much about it today because it doesn't exist or is very rare in Europe and North America, but it's actually quite common in the East.
I think cholera makes a great example for this discussion. Again, thank you for this question, because cholera, again, typically becomes only a global health concern when it reaches Europe. There is no discussion of cholera in historical epidemiology before it hits Europe, and that's dated usually to 1830s. That's a big, first cholera pandemic, and then it repeats in several cholera pandemics until, throughout the 19th century or until early 20th century. So, and in fact, most of the public health institutions that we have today really go back to that period in terms of the formation of the origins of those institutions. In the 19th century, we see the formation of international sanitary conferences that started with cholera pandemic, and throughout it's whenever it was repeated. So several international conferences. In fact, those international sanitary conferences, they were the origin of World Health Organization. So there is a direct continuity with 19th century ideas of global public health and our modern notions of global public health. But here, and again, just, that brings up back to cholera, a very significant piece to emphasize here is that what 19th century international sanitary conferences and that effort tried was really to protect Europe from global health threats. So even though those organizations were kind of, done in a way to protect it, was like protect whose health, right? It's only, you look at I mean, I spent a lot of time reading those conference proceedings, and in fact, the Ottoman Empire was also part of those discussions and participated in international sanitary conferences. And the Hajj, the pilgrimage route becomes a very important source of concern around that time, because every time you have the Muslim pilgrimage and just, large numbers of people gathering there, and the, cholera outbreaks were, of course, caused great numbers of people dying. But all those discussions were like done such a way that, how do we stop the disease coming from Europe? Right? Not really like, it's of course geopolitically just very kind of, it's very obvious. So looking at the Red Sea and all the ships coming from India, and they're all very suspicious of those individuals bringing disease, kind of like very kind of openly talked about in that way. But the whole idea is like, how do we stop it there so that it doesn't get to Europe? So this is a long way of saying, yes, it's very important to decolonize disease narratives, same in the 14th century as it was in the 19th century, as it is today, because not only important for history, but also important for policy making today.
We have a question here that you mentioned that these plagues are not controlled by weather. For example, you said that people expected, and you referenced that COVID was expected to go away in the summer, but it didn't happen. Some of these new diseases and plagues are, the questioner mentions that some of them are emerging and probably getting intensified because of climate change. If so, does that mean that some regions of the world are going to be hit in ways more severe than others?
Right. Again, great question. And it is very, very closely connected. Plague is one form of what we call emerging infectious diseases. And COVID is an emergent infectious diseases. So SARS, MERS, Ebola, these are all emerging infectious diseases. The sense that, one is a newer disease, the other is an older disease, doesn't matter. What really matters is to understand their mechanism of emergence, right? So these pathogens, whether they're viruses, bacteria, parasites, and whatnot, it comes from, some of them are as old as humanity, right? They live comfortably in an animal host. As long as humans don't interact with the habitat of that environment, they will continue to, because they don't make those host animals sick. That's why they're hosts. There's a kind of a symbiosis working with the host, right? The problem, we are the problems here, of course. Well, human-induced climate change, but also human kind of invasion, intrusion in the natural environment. Most of it, again, takes the form of just, depleting those animals and kind of causing them to migrate, eradicating their natural habitats and forcing them to move elsewhere. And when they move, and of course they come into contact with other animals, and that also can create pandemics. And again, when you look at the origin of all pandemics, like the primary reason is climate change and invasion of their habitats, and also depletion of or reduction in biological diversity. So these are the primary conditions in which pandemics emerge. And today, as we learned our lesson with this pandemic, it is impossible to stop them once they spread, especially if they're an airborne pathogen. I mean, of course, the biggest challenge in COVID was caused by asymptomatic cases and the divided international scientific community about transmission of asymptomatic cases. In other diseases, like if we're talking about SARS, right? SARS can only be transmitted when the infection is really like the person is openly infectious and like sick, right? That is easier to control, and that's why we had 8,000 SARS cases globally, right? And we have over 40 million COVID cases. So it depends on how it will go. After that, it depends on the specific biological circumstance of the disease. But how they emerge is definitely related to ecological disturbances and climate.
Okay, thank you so very much, Professor Varlık, for this really rich and really great talk. There were a few questions that were left. You had many, many questions and you generated a lot of interest. I don't know if I should say this or not, but if anyone is really interested in getting in touch with Professor Varlık, she's here. She's a faculty member in our department. We're very fortunate to have her. And so she'll be around. And so you can get in touch, or you can get in touch with one of us if you have any questions or are interested in the Mediterranean Displacements Project. Please visit our website listed here, sites.rutgers.edu/MDP. And if you're interested in collaborating or contributing, we are very excited to start this project and start working together. Once again, Professor Varlık, thank you so very much for this great talk. And please stay tuned. Our next lecture will be at the beginning of November. The details will be posted on the website. We are also creating a Facebook page and a Twitter account to keep you updated with all of the events. And our next speaker is also from the Federated History Department at Rutgers Newark. We're very fortunate that we have a lot of people working on the subject. Professor Leila Amzi, who will be talking about migration and nation, and she will be discussing the late Ottoman period. So thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Professor Varlık again, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Nükhet.
So I am ending this.
I was muted.